Plugged it
There
back
you
in.
go.
So let's see what happens when. Oh, there I am. Oh, look, and my hair looks good. Okay. Yes. Yes.
There we go. And you've got a lovely blue background.
You know, I stole it from the dermatologist. And I think Eleanor's trying to talk, but she forgets that she's muted.
Sorry. You stole what? Sorry, from the dermatologist?
I stole this blue background. So this,
Oh.
this
I
is like when
thought you were
talk
saying
about, like, alignment. Like, so when I interviewed, they kind of took me around and like were showing me different things. They showed me, just kind of happenstance, the dermatologist's office, and she had this blue wall. And I literally said, if they give me this job, no matter where my office is, I want that color in my office. And so when I got the job, I was like, can I have that color, please? Please? Like, yeah. So
I thought you were going to say that you stole like a cream or a shampoo from them. And I was like, how? They have this big sample of this big closet of derm samples, but they lock it so that we can't all just take things.
Oh, really? They do? Oh, I feel like you just challenged me to like go up there and do it.
I think if you work up there, you could probably sneak in every now and then, but yeah. I'm sure if you ask, they'll open it, but they have like, sunscreens and all kinds of fancy things that get dropped off from the companies.
Yeah, well, I take that. I will tell them. Dr. Tanno said that I should come up here and raid the closet, so I'm here to do that.
Well, I've never seen the inside of the closet. I just know that the closet exists, so it may be very good. I don't quote me on that.
So gonna quote you.
You share that information when the office is closed, so she can't actually go and check it out just yet.
Yeah, but when she's there for one of the few days she is there, no one else is
now.
No one else is around.
But you need a badge to get in, so it won't work.
Here's my badge.
So I put in the chat, I put the link to the implicit bias test in case anyone missed it in the email, because I feel like somebody's gonna ask about it.
Oh yes, good call there.
And then I listened, last let me pull it up, because last night I listened to this fabulous, it was actually like through, it was a podcast. It was on implicit bias. I don't know if you, tell me if you like know this person's name. Because she might be somebody who comes up to you. Jennifer Eberhardt. She did a TED Talk. It was really good. It was 15 minutes on racial bias and how to disrupt it. And it was, like I said, it was like a 15-minute talk. It was really interesting. But I didn't know if she was some, mega expert in the field or something. Although I guess if she's having a TED Talk, she's probably a pretty big name. But you what?
She's definitely a bigger name. Yeah, definitely a bigger name than we are.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's nice to see people, I'm like, hello.
I love you. I know. Fun.
Let me see if I can find her TED Talk, and then I'll put it on. I'll put
a link up. That's awesome.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Actually, and there was an article I was just reading last night on implicit bias that was really good, that I think will also on implicit bias in healthcare.
Okay.
Put that up too. It's called "How Does Implicit Bias by Physicians Affect Patients' Healthcare?"
Okay, here it is. Okay. This is good. So I'll post this one too in the chat, so people, if they're interested, they can make that later. Anyone have good weekend plans?
We're doing a 99th birthday party for my grandfather on Zoom.
You're gonna 99th birthday?
99th birthday. Big Zoom party.
That is awesome. Oh my gosh.
Next year in person.
Does he know?
He doesn't know that he thinks it's just immediate family. He doesn't know that it's, his nieces and nephews and friends from, previous places he's lived and all that.
Oh my gosh, he's gonna love it. Oh my gosh. I bet I would cry. Like, Oh my gosh.
It's gonna
That's gotta
cry.
be a lot of people. How do you coordinate that?
I mean, my parents sent it. My mom sent out an email, but I got video messages from everybody and made a video montage of everybody sending wishes, favorite memories, and he hasn't seen anyone for 3 months on lockdown. So this is nice.
That is gonna be so sweet.
99, and he's been alone for 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, he's in the ring house. So
He's in the
strict.
Yeah.
in the what?
The ring house, like living residence, independent living residence, and it's like around the corner from the office.
Wow.
All right. Well, let me at least go ahead and talk about lectures for next week, because I think while people are joining. So for those of you who are here, it looks like we have a small crowd so far, but hopefully people will join in the next few minutes. I'm Dr. Tanno. I am one of the family medicine physicians at Rockville Internal Medicine, and I have been organizing these webinars. So if you haven't been watching, then I'm a new face, but if you're watching, you've seen me all the time. And then today we have some special guests. Dr. Moskowitz is a clinical psychologist in our office, and Dr. Holmes is a internist in our office who joined in February. And they're going to be talking about implicit bias. But let me just give you a little update on what's happening next week. On Monday, we have a talk from an outsider. So for those of you who have seen Toy Story, it's like somebody from the outside world. It's Dr. Vivek Patil, sorry. He is a colorectal surgeon at Maryland Oncology Hematology. So for those of you who saw Dr. O'Connor's talk on Wednesday on medical cancer genetics, she is a partner with this other doctor, and he is going to talk about some common causes of rectal bleeding and rectal pain. The name of his talk is A Talk About Things We Don't Talk About. So hopefully good. And on Wednesday of next week, we have Dr. Holmes back with Dr. Cowan, Kelly Cowan, who has been in the practice now for many years, and many of you guys probably know her. And they are going to be talking about medical marijuana. Dr. Cowan has her medical marijuana license and has been seeing a few patients, not a huge cohort for people, and talking people through it and going through some treatment. So the two of them are going to talk about that. That should be interesting. And I put some links in the chat already for those of you who are tuning in. So the first one is the link for the Harvard implicit bias tests. These are the home self-tests. This is the same link that went out with the email and was on our website. So if you got a chance to do some of those little quizzes in advance, they're very helpful and interesting. But if you didn't, then you can click on that link and do it later. And then I also posted a TED Talk. This was just a 15-minute talk I happened to listen to last night on implicit bias, and it was fascinating. So I'll just give you the catch. When I started it, the woman who gave the TED Talk said that she was on an airplane with her son when he was 5 years old. It was his first airplane ride. He looked around the plane and he said, "Mom, that man looks like Daddy." And so she turned around to see what he was talking about, and her 5-year-old pointed at the only African-American man on the plane. And she said, I guess, you assume from her telling the story that her son's dad is African-American. And she said, "He doesn't look anything like Daddy. He's just the only other African-American man on the plane." And then her 5-year-old said, "I hope he doesn't rob us." And she horrified because, that's a statement. And so anyway, her research is an implicit bias. They are an African-American family. So the idea that her son at such a young age would already be sort of programmed to have that kind of association is crazy, growing up in a family with two parents who are African-American. So anyway, it's a good talk. It's like 15 minutes. I would highly recommend if you want to click on that link and listen to it later. And then Dr. Moskowitz posted another link, which I'll let her tell you more about that. So I'll let them go ahead and get started. And I'll see you guys at the end for questions, and then back on Monday for more webinars.
All right. So I think let me just share my screen to get into, there's that article. Okay, so here's some of our slides. If you see me present before, you know I love my whiteboards. So we're going to talk about implicit bias in healthcare, and maybe we can first just take a chance to kind of introduce ourselves and talk about how we got to this topic. You know, I know a lot of us have been watching the news unfold in the last couple of weeks, and you know, doing some deep thinking about ourselves and our communities, and looking at what's been going on, not just in the last couple of weeks, but what that means about what's been going on for a very long time. And so I thought it would be, well, I reached out to Dr. Holmes, and she had the idea of making this into a webinar, and kind of broadening that conversation to the RMG community, and talking about how it affects healthcare in particular. And, you know, this whole notion of implicit bias, kind of what is it and how it shows up. And I think something I've noticed in some of these conversations that have unfolded in the last couple of weeks is that it's very hard for people to wrap their heads around the idea of you know, racial bias being something that you aren't aware of, that, you know, you're going, well, I'm not a racist, so how could I do something racist? Or how can you accuse me of racism? Or, you know, and you can say the same thing for gender bias or any other kind of bias. It's very strange for us to think that we don't have control over our awareness over our own thoughts and actions. And so for my piece, I wanted to contribute to this, and this is gonna be the first half of our talk, is about just kind of understanding from a cognitive psychology perspective how implicit bias works and why it's really not such a strange or unusual thing. And it actually kind of depends on circuitry that is pretty hardwired into us and that our brain really needs to navigate the world. It just kind of gets skewed in certain contexts. But so I'm coming at it from a kind of cognitive psychology perspective, how this actually works, and then over to you, Dr. Holmes, for kind of your piece. Dr. Holmes? Hello?
Sorry, I forgot that I was muted, and I was like chuckling under my breath. Yeah, for our discussion on kind of how it applies to healthcare and just really how it applies to our health in general. So, you know, you had stated, like, I was really touched by the email that you sent to me, kind of when things broke out in the news and when things kind of came to a head with, you know, George Floyd, and it really like touched me that you would reach out to me. And so then kind of responding to you and then talking about like how can we have a good conversation, because it is something that even I deal with as a provider and a physician, and just as a human being, that and it's always, I think that's why I like the topic and why it kind of makes me laugh, because it's these things that we don't even realize that we're doing until it's really brought to our awareness. Then it's like, oh dang, I didn't really mean that at all, you know. And it's just kind of like dealing with that in your own right, as an individual, and then also considering, especially when it's called out to me by my patients, you know, that I'll say something and be like, oh well, I never thought about it like that, you know, and then kind of how that shapes their perception of me, and then how that shapes how they respond to the suggestions that I make, you know, as regards to their health. So yes, I'm really excited about this.
Cool. And I just realized I'm staring at the screen here. I realized I misspelled your name. So I left out the H. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. I don't take it personally.
All right. As somebody whose name gets butchered all the time, I feel you. So sorry about that. All right. So let's dig in. So, you know, for starters, if we kind of back way up and just thinking about how our brain works and what our brain has to do every moment, every day that we're awake. And I mean, you just think about the sheer volume of sensory input and information that our brains are constantly getting bombarded with. There's a number I saw when I was researching for this talk today, and it said that our brains get 11 million bits of information every second, and we can only be aware of 40 of them. And like my graduate training told me to do. You got to kind of look at your sources and see where it came from and see if it's legit. And I couldn't find a good original citation for that number, so I don't really know where it comes from and didn't want to put it in writing here. But even if it just kind of gives us a rough idea, you think about using your five senses and the way that the people that you see or the information that you read or you hear and your environment and all the things around you, it's too much for you to consciously deliberately be aware of all the time. And so your brain really just needs these shortcuts to function efficiently in the world, and you need to be able to kind of filter out a lot of this stuff. And so there's this great book, I have it here, by Daniel Kahneman. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. It came out in 2011. And he is, if you haven't heard of him before, he and his colleague, Amos Tversky, they are two Israeli psychologists. Tversky died, but they were working together on this whole field of within cognitive psychology, thinking about these kind of mental shortcuts and biases that we tend to make. And they got the Nobel Prize in economics, actually, even though they're not economists, they're psychologists. But he came up with this sort of model or analogy, kind of a way of understanding our thinking, that we have these two tracks, and you can kind of think of it as two kinds of roads, right? Our system one thought, it's like the superhighway of your brain. So that's how we can kind of rapidly integrate, process, respond to information in a really quick and efficient way. And so just like a superhighway, this kind of mode of thinking, it's fast, it's efficient, it's direct. You can kind of go on autopilot. You can have a high capacity of vehicles or high capacity of thoughts all kind of going through at the same time. And this kind of describes our intuitive thinking. If I was to say to you, what's 100 plus 10, it's 110. It's very quick. You don't have to really concentrate to do that math. I know if somebody asks me, do you want to go out for pizza or to a steakhouse tonight? I'm immediately going to say pizza, because I know intuitively that I hate red meat. Never have liked it. So very easy, very immediate decision-making. And that works for a large part of our lives, but then sometimes we really need to be using the local roads. And that's our system two thought. So that's our kind of slower, deliberative, logical thought processes. And this is the kind of thinking that you need to do when you really need to make an informed choice. Whereas you can make a kind of a snap judgment about what restaurant you're going to go to order your food for dinner. You need to use a really slow, logical thought process for things like buying a house or deciding, what you want to major in college, or, who you're going to marry, big things like that. You really, really want to be thinking about a lot. And so that kind of logical, deliberate thought, it's really important, but it also is really, it kind of takes on a big load. It's pretty burdensome, and our brain kind of really needs to be efficient. And so it's going to use those local roads and those slower, deliberative thoughts when it has to, but it's really going to try to use the superhighways as much as it can. So, and I think it's important for us to remember that we need system one and system two just to function as people in the world, and really as people in a social world. So if you think about, we've got this picture of this person, and they're just seeing they've got somebody kind of in their mind. And if you look at this guy that just drawn here, you might form all kinds of immediate impressions or guesses about, who he is or how you'd feel about him. And it would be too much for you to kind of consciously look at, okay, well, what is his gender and what is his age and his race and his weight, and all these little things that you're noticing about him automatically, immediately, not even being aware of it. And, when we see people, we're just automatically, immediately having often some kind of emotional reaction, right? Some people, we see them, we immediately feel love, if that's one of our loved ones, or we feel disgust, or we feel hostility, or we feel something. And we're making all kinds of snap judgments and assuming certain things about who they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing what they're doing, and we're going to expect certain things about them. And those immediate system one kind of thoughts are going to guide our behavior. And I think that example that Dr. Tanno shared at the beginning about from that TED Talk, you've got this 5-year-old boy from an African-American family who sees the one Black man on the plane, and says, oh, he looks like daddy. And then he says, oh, is he going to rob us? Because he's at age 5, he's already got all of these kind of assumptions and expectations wired even then. And so, there's this, the other fancy word for kind of system 1 thoughts about other people is implicit social cognition. And that term was coined actually 15, 16 years before that book came out. This is from a paper in 1995 where they kind of laid out this idea of implicit social cognition. So implicit being something that's you're kind of unaware of, it's hidden, social being people, and cognition being thinking. So the idea being that we have these automatic, immediate thoughts about other people, and we're not aware of having them. The benefit is that it's very efficient, and it helps us really quickly process all kinds of complex social information. If you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, it's really important to be able to kind of suss up other people and to be able to kind of separate friend from foe. And is this somebody who's going to come, attack me or hurt me, or is this somebody I can trust? So we need that kind of system 1 thinking to function. And if, especially I would say to the women out there, if you've ever been walking alone by yourself in, kind of like a dark area, and you see somebody passing by, you've got that kind of creepy crawly feeling in the back of your neck. And, it's that immediate sense, do I trust this person? Is this person a danger? The drawbacks are that it can be kind of it's really sloppy because it's so fast and it relies on a lot of generalizations. And so it's not always accurate. And it can perpetuate, certain biases and stereotypes that we're not even aware of, because it's happening so rapidly and outside of our awareness. And it's that last piece that's so insidious, because you can say, I'm not racist, I'm not misogynist, I'm not homophobic, whatever it is, and consciously believe certain things that are in line with your values, and still at the same time have these associations and have these reactions and biases that, you're not proud of and you don't want, but they're there anyway. And so the good thing, and that can kind of help us understand this, is that there's some really predictable shortcuts that our system 1 thought takes on. And specifically in this kind of context of that implicit social cognition, right? So our kind of rapid thinking about other people, it uses certain shortcuts and biases. And a lot of this is related to the research, again, from Kahneman and Tversky. They're talking about these kind of mental shortcuts in all kinds of situations, not just social situations, but here we're going to focus on these social situations. So I thought for these, and maybe kind of go through and explain them one by one, what each one means, and then maybe Dr. Holmes, we can open up a conversation about where we see these things showing up in real life, how we see them showing up in health and healthcare, in the way that providers respond to patients, or the way that patients kind of see their providers. And so we can really make this, bring it home. So the first one is in-group bias, and that is that we have this innate tendency to prefer people who are like us. So, whether that's your race or your gender or your religion or whatever it is, we're going to feel more comfortable. We're going to feel more familiar. If we have good self-esteem, we like ourselves and they're like us. And so we're going to like them too. And so that is just, again, from an evolutionary standpoint, makes perfect sense. Right? You're going to have that kind of bias towards your kin and be wary of strangers and outsiders. But obviously that can be problematic in the real world. Do you want me to, Dr. Holmes, would you prefer if we kind of go through these one by one and talk about examples for each, or do you want me to just kind of list them all and then we'll kind of go into a conversation?
Well, I was thinking you were going to list them all and then we can go through a conversation about experiences we've had with them.
Awesome. Okay. So that's in-group bias. That's pretty self-explanatory. Mere exposure effect. The idea here is that just by being exposed to something more frequently, you're going to like it more. So kind of like, if there's a song you hear on the radio, maybe the first time it's like, okay, it's kind of okay. and then you hear it a whole bunch, and then you grow to like it more and more. I mean, then it gets to the point of saturation that you hear it too much and you're sick of it. But but before that point, just being exposed to something more, you're gonna like it more. And so, if you've had more exposure to certain groups of people, you're gonna feel probably more comfortable and familiar with them, and you're gonna like them more. The halo effect or the horn effect are our tendency. If somebody has one positive attribute, that's kind of their halo over them, and we're going to see a whole bunch of other positive attributes. So maybe if somebody's attractive, we're also going to kind of assume that they're smart and capable and nice and whatever. If somebody has one negative attribute, then that kind of that's like the devil horns over them, and that kind of casts a cloud over everything else about them, and we'll probably be more likely to interpret things about them in a negative way. And I'll just throw out an example that has nothing to do with implicit bias in healthcare, but just to kind of illustrate. When I was 16 in driver's ed class, I was a kid who was always like super calm and sweet and got along well with people and never got in trouble, and people knew that I had a good reputation. And one of my friends was somebody she was like really short and had a big personality to kind of compensate, and was really loud and had really sassy, and she could kind of rub people the wrong way and get in trouble. And in our driver's ed class, I was into crocheting for a little while, and I'd like sit in class and crochet. And one day our teacher said, he's like, you look like an angel, but you're really a devil, because he hated the crocheting class. He said to her, he's like, you look like a devil, but you're really an angel. Or I think about how like my husband and his brother growing up, my husband was the good kid and his brother got in trouble. And so he said my husband said he could like drop a plate on the kitchen floor and have it shatter. And then his parents would look at his brother and say, what did you do to make him do that? Right. They're always going to assume he was the troublemaker. And so, these examples are, they're funny in these contexts, but we'll get into kind of how they show up in a problematic way in real life. Fundamental attribution error is our tendency. If I screw up and I'm kind of snappy at somebody, I'm going to say, oh, I'm having a really bad day. I'm under a lot of stress. This is the situation. This is what happens, behind the scenes. I'm going to have a whole narrative of why this wasn't me being mean or nasty or being a bad person. This was just me having a bad day, right? But then somebody else is going to say something or do something, and we're not going to attribute it to their circumstances or them having a bad day. Or we're going to say, oh, well, that person is, they're a jerk. They're a bad person, whatever. We're going to really personalize that when we're judging other people's behavior. Mm-hmm. Outgroup homogeneity bias. This is the idea that other groups are all the same. Like, okay, all Black people are the same, or all Jewish people are the same, or all whatever. But our own group, there's a lot of diversity and a lot of complexity and differences. And I think about this in a kind of extreme way. So when I was growing up, I went to a Jewish school, and there was a lot of this kind of narrative of like Jewish people versus non-Jewish people in the world. And I kind of grew up thinking like, putting all non-Jewish people in one big bucket, which, when I then grew up and went to college and was out in the real world exposed to a lot of non-Jewish people, I was like, wow, that was not
zero focus. Yeah.
I mean, and now I can look back and say that's crazy to think that way, that okay, all non-Jewish people are the same. But that was kind of the perspective I was kind of coming from as a kid and kind of living in that bubble. So that is, we could definitely talk about how that shows up in a huge way in healthcare when we're encountering people from different groups and kind of making certain assumptions that they're all the same.
They're all the same, yeah.
Okay, availability heuristic. This is the idea that just because something comes to mind easily, we think it's more common or more true. So the classic example for this is when you look at people's fear of dying in a plane crash versus dying in a car crash. or plane crash. That's not the right word. But yeah, plane goes down.
Morbid.
Sorry.
I said morbid, dying in a plane crash.
I know. But but I see a lot of people who have a plane phobia and they refuse to get on planes. But they're going to get in the car every day, all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because when there's a fatal car crash, it's not front page news of the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's something in like the back of the metro section, because it happens all the time.
Right.
But when a plane goes down, that is a big deal. And it's the same thing. It's often another example, like shark attacks. Like people are much more, your risk of being attacked by a shark is way less than, I don't know, other things that are way more common that you don't think about. But, if you can, if you have that image that comes to mind really readily, you're going to kind of overestimate it. And the way this comes back to, I think of that example that Dr. Tanno shared again, if that 5-year-old boy had if he had seen a lot of images in the media and been kind of exposed to this idea that, okay, black man equals, he's going to rob us, that's the availability heuristic. That's what comes to mind. And so that's what he assumes is going to be more common, to be the risk of, that person in that moment. And then confirmation bias is that our brains tend to be very uncomfortable with kind of holding conflicting ideas in our head, or conflict between our behavior and our beliefs. We want things to be consistent. We're not comfortable with what's called cognitive dissonance. So we tend to seek out information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So if there's a group that you have kind of ill feelings against, again, let's say like you have certain assumptions about how black people are, or how men or women are, or how old people are. When somebody from that group does something that doesn't really fit with your model, you're not gonna pay as much attention. But when they do something that confirms your belief, you're gonna be like, yep, that's just how they are. It's also why we tend to read news sources that kind of conform to our way of seeing the world, because it's just a lot more comfortable for us mentally to see things that agree with us. So, and these are just, put up 7 here. There's so many other examples, but I thought these are some that we could talk about that would be pretty common. So
I remember looking at this because you sent me the slide. I remember looking at this slide, and not coming from a psychological background, of course I'm like looking them up, like while my baby is asleep, and I'm trying to like, what is this, but it was really eye-opening for me, because while in medical school and residency, in like some of our small group sessions, things like that, we never used these particular terms, but these are definitely things that we talked about in the healthcare field, as things that as providers we kind of have to we're going to experience and have to kind of overcome in dealing with our patients. And I remember as a resident, it was my first year. So I was an intern, and I remember taking care of this wonderful, cute little 100-year-old lady that was brought into the emergency room. And I want to say, I think it was like for dehydration. She hadn't been drinking and things like that. And she was African American. And I was really, just thrilled, because I was an intern care of anybody. And I remember so this is like going to that availability heuristic, social cognition. I remember, she was transferred up to her room, and because I missed her in the ER. So I went up to her room to see her, and the room was kind of dark, and I, kind of knocked on the door, and I went in, and, was like, waking her up, and I, felt really bad. And I was like, I need to, talk with you. And she was like, honey, turn on the light. And, so I turned on the light, and she looked at me, her eyes got really big. And she was like, who are you? And I was like, I'm your doctor. No, you're not. You're not my doctor. And I'm like, yes, Dr. Holmes, you're black. And I was sitting here like, yeah, you are not no doctor. I mean, it just literally went off on me and talked about how I was not her doctor. And she pressed the call button, had the nurse come in. That doctor, that nice doctor man that came and brought me up here, that's who I want to talk to about my health and yada, yada, yada. And she was talking about the transportation aide that had brought her up.
Wow.
Who was Caucasian. And it was just like this moment, like tunnel vision. I just burst out laughing because she had never in her life experienced having an African American person as her physician or provider, and so the thought that I was coming in my, I mean, I had on my white coat, I had on my stethoscope, I had my badge, it had my name on it, like everything, and the nurses are trying to tell her, that I was her physician, and she just was not having any of it. And so finally we ended up, and so you encounter these biases and these things, but you still have to deliver care. And so we ended up bringing her, the transportation tech up. We found him, brought him up. He introduced himself. She still wasn't having it. So he basically told her that I was his assistant and that I was going to be taking notes and that, whatever he said, I was going to do, and so that is how I had to conduct her care. This was like in the evening time because it was a night shift. And so that, there would be a new team of doctors in the morning and, just this whole thing. And so literally, that is the only way that I could actually engage in the conversation. And, it was really interesting for me to have like that experience where this woman, like literally emphatically was just like, I could not be her doctor, but she was like 100 and some odd years old and just had never seen it and did not think that I was capable of doing that. And then, flash, a few weeks later, I was in resident clinic and this young woman came in and literally broke down in tears because she had never seen a physician of color and was so happy that she felt like she was going to be listened to because she had never had a physician of color and felt that physicians who did not look like, didn't understand her and her health illness. And so it really, so as a physician, as a provider, it really like it's interesting to me and why I get really excited about talking about this because it is something that as a provider I feel like I do as a provider, and I'm sure my other colleagues do. We struggle with and how to get our patients to buy into who we are and to believe that they are heard. And I hear patients coming to me and saying like, oh, so and so and so and so, they didn't listen, and it was like, okay, what about that interaction do you feel like that they didn't listen? And it's not anything that they can say, well, they didn't listen because they got this or this wrong, but it was the perception, their encounter and their interaction and how our behavior was that made them feel that way. Well, the doctor was always at the computer, and they were typing, and so like talking to patients about, well, the doctor's probably typing because they wanted to catch down everything that you said to make sure that they had the right information. And so that's why I think it's interesting to look at all of these different types of shortcuts that we have, because those shortcuts do play a role and even I fall prey to it sometimes, as often as a human being, like, oh, she's not listening because she's not looking at me, and then I have to slow myself down and think, okay, she may not be looking at me, what is she doing? Like, so she's doing this and this and this and this, and start really teasing apart, like, okay, so maybe I'm just assuming that, but that's not really what's going on. And I feel like I've been talking for too long, but
there's a couple of things I just wanted to pick up on there. One, I think that's a really good example of the fundamental attribution error, right? Like you see somebody's behavior and you're just going to assume, make a judgment or assumption about that. Okay, well, he's on his computer, so he's not listening to me. And then the providers say, well, I have to want to get everything down. I want to pay attention to all that. And so that's, a good example of how that difference in perspective shows up. But also, I'm really struck when you're saying that people feel like you don't feel listened to, but they can't really pinpoint what it is exactly. And I think that kind of speaks to how subtle some of these things are. There's been, the research on this stuff is interesting, and there's some criticism of these implicit association tests. So do want to acknowledge that, but they are that is kind of the predominant tool in this research, and I think this is in the article that I shared in the chat, but they've done studies where they look at physician-patient interactions, and they give the physicians measures of these implicit association tests, as well as kind of, overt self-report, attitudes about, race or gender, whatever. And it was the physicians with the biggest mismatch between kind of the attitudes that they're going to write about on these self-report forms versus kind of how they score on these implicit bias tests, implicit association tests. Those were the physicians with whom the patients felt most uncomfortable. And there's something that people pick up on where there's that disconnect where maybe they're not doing anything overt, but you can feel that they don't really like you, or maybe they're kind of suspicious of you, or maybe they're making they're not really listening, or whatever it is. You can feel that difference. I'm curious about examples that kind of come to your mind where you feel, I'm kind of linking back to Dr. Council was talking last week about health disparities. And there's these major disparities in health outcomes by race that's not, you control for socioeconomic, for income and education and all that. And that doesn't make it go away entirely. And so there's a lot of this interest in, okay, well, is it, what happens in the actual encounters between patients and providers where maybe this implicit bias is actually affecting people's health and healthcare?
I really feel like what really happened, I feel like it's a subconscious wall that gets built up, that patients sometimes, I feel like what they tell me, they don't feel comfortable to say X, Y, and Z. I have patients who I feel like gravitate to me sometimes because they're like, oh my gosh, I feel like you're my best friend, or I feel like you're my cousin. And that's, typically why I try not to wear the white coat, because I want to kind of break down these rules, because, patients and even society put physicians like on this pedestal of, we can do no wrong. And, a physician's worst nightmare, I think, is causing harm to a patient. And this idea that this level of immense trust is put into the office of physician and provider, and as nurse practitioners, this immense level of trust that patients come to us and like, here's my health, I give it to you, take care of it. And then if there's this wall where they're not giving us all of this information, don't feel like they can trust us with all of this information, then we're kind of running and dealing with healthcare issues blind. And so, it's like trying to break down those stereotypes of that stodgy, physician with his white coat who comes in and, it becomes, okay, this is what, we need to do, and trying to break that apart, because in order for us to take good care of patients, we have to, have that kind of discourse, and there has to be that I'm going to tell you what I think, you're going to tell me what you think, and I'm going to be okay that you don't agree. But we have to find some common ground, or I have to support you in whatever decision. And then when you add into there the level of health disparities, and then you bring into there, the issue of ethnicity, race, religious beliefs, and trusting that a physician is going to honor that and understand that, really takes on a whole different front. I was reading an article, and of course, I'm not big on the whole like statistics and stuff like that. That's not my strong suit. But I was reading in the article that that there was research done about looking at preventative care services ordered by physicians of color versus preventative care services ordered by physicians not of color for patients of color, and that physicians of color tend to have better buy-in in getting these preventative measures taken care of, because I think there's also that in-group bias of, okay, I see someone who looks like me, okay, so she or he is saying I should do this, okay, so I'm going to trust, because there is a level of mistrust, in in the population in that our group of healthcare. I mean, because of different of historical issues that have happened in the past. But getting these healthcare needs met is still important, and so it comes down to patients seeing you. So if I don't look like you, okay, but I still need to reach you to get you to trust that when I say you really need to have a colonoscopy right now, that you need to have that colonoscopy done, and even though I may look like you, I'm not trying to circumvent you. And so patients have to even understand that they have that bias. Like they look at physicians like, I'm not going to trust what they say. But this person is the person you're putting your trust in to take care of you. So why are you not going to listen to what they say? Why are you going to second guess that? What about that? And talk to your physician, I say, about that, or your provider. I keep saying physician, I need to say provider because my mom's a nurse practitioner and she'll hit me. But talk to your provider about that. Like, okay, I don't trust this. See, yeah, Eleanor almost popped up. She was gonna say something. I don't trust what you're saying and dealing with that area. Yeah, but I keep talking, so I'm gonna be quiet when it pops up.
Oh, hey, what I was gonna say is, we don't have a ton of time left, so if
you see,
solicit for questions, or I know we had sent that link in advance for people to do the implicit bias home quizzes. If anyone had any comments on that, I just wanted to make sure people had time to tune in and to chime in and give you any kind of thoughts, or if you guys had any. I just wanted to make sure that people had time to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. Actually, maybe this would be a good time to go. We've got one more slide, so maybe we'll just get into that and then really open up to questions. Because I think we get back to to all the things that you're saying, Dr. Holmes, that this is really thorny stuff, right? And it's really hard to to recognize this stuff in ourselves, to see how it's showing up in our interactions with people. And so we get to this question, okay, well, now what? What do you do about it? Because it's so hard when you're not even aware of it. So I've got just some thoughts here, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts too, and then we can get into questions. But I would say, just like a lot of the work I do is helping people deal with, unpleasant thoughts and unpleasant emotions. And our natural impulse is to want to stamp those things out. I don't want to have those thoughts. I don't want to have those feelings. I just want to get rid of them. Help me get rid of my anxiety. Help me get rid of these negative thoughts. And that's not actually realistic, because that's just part of how our brains work. And so likewise, we want to say, okay, well, how do I get rid of this bias? I don't want to have this bias. I mean, I'll tell you honestly, I took the IAT myself, and I'm horrified by my results. And because, we all have this stuff. And so it's like, oh, how do I get rid of this? So the first step is just, we just recognize that it's there. And if we can recognize it and not be defensive about it, not deny it, then we can really deal with it. That's really the first step. And so we want to pay attention when we have these kind of first impressions, snap judgments of people. We want to just kind of pause and say, oh, what am I, when I saw that person, what feeling came up? Was that a feeling of, of trust and connection, or was it a feeling of kind of mistrust and hostility? And what am I feeling? What am I thinking about that person? What am I having an urge to do? And just something to be curious. Well, why am I feeling and thinking this way? Does it really have to do with this person in this situation, or is this kind of other stuff coming up? And just to people to acknowledge that, okay, this is my system one thinking kicking in. It's really quick. It's going to do its thing. It's helpful in some ways, but it's not always accurate. So, so maybe we can step back and kind of consider, what are some other ways of seeing this person, or other ways of understanding their behavior, and just kind of making it more of a system two kind of thought process. And then the final piece is also just kind of coming back to that mirror exposure effect, that we tend to be kind of predisposed towards people who either are kind of in our in-group or who we're familiar with. So one way to overcome that is to just be exposed to more people, be exposed to different examples of, again, coming back to that 5-year-old boy, if all he's seeing kind of portrayed, and that's not all he's even seeing, but if, so much more so for any of us who are from a different race, if all we're seeing is people who from a certain group who behave in a certain way, we're going to have certain assumptions. But if we can kind of see different examples, of different people from different groups, we're just going to have a much more nuanced, sophisticated way of seeing people who are different from us. So that's and so I'm curious, Dr. Holmes, kind of things that you'd add to that in terms of what do you do about this implicit bias, and either kind of in a healthcare setting or just in general.
So I think in general, because I think, it applies to all areas and aspects of our lives. And I would say, in addition to being curious, and internalizing it, also externalize your thoughts. So, ask questions. Like I'm, infamous, for asking, really weird. And I always say, forgive my ignorance. I'm sorry. Because it comes from a place of ignorance. It comes from a place of not knowing. So I will ask questions. Like I think I shocked our CEO, Dr. Pollock. Is he a CEO, CFO, CMO?
No.
He is. I think, he and I were talking in the office, and
he's king.
And
I'm just kidding.
He's king. King Pollock. And I was asking him this question about one of his sons who is a rabbi. And he's probably going to kill me for this. If I get fired, this is why. Who's a rabbi, but he does not. So in my understanding, and this is my limited scope of not understanding a lot, I think of a rabbi, they have a flock, like they're a preacher, they have a flock. But no, he actually does like work with like breaking down like in pursuing justice. And so he does not have a flock. And so like I was asking him these questions, and I saw the look on his face, and I swear he was like, did I really hire you? Like, are you that stupid? But it literally is just coming from like my perspective of not having this exposure. And so then when he started talking to me about it, I was like, oh, okay. So it's like, a pastor of my church who may not have, or a pastor or someone who, went to seminary school, but decides that they want to do social work, and so I just started like, but I had to start making these connections within my head of my experiences. So, but the only way that I would be able to do that was to make myself vulnerable, to broaden my exposure and say, look, I'm going to plead ignorance. I don't really know what I'm talking about. Please don't take offense, but let me, someone who has this exposure, give me some more insight. And so I think when dealing with, these subtle kind of unknown, if once you recognize it, sometimes you're not going to find the answer just in and of yourself. You've got to go to the source or someone who may have more experience or more knowledge and say, okay, look, can you clue me in and educate me? But that's sometimes very, very hard to do, because you have to be vulnerable, but you have to be willing to take the criticism and take the education. So that's the other thing that I would add.
Yeah. So it's that leaning into the discomfort, the discomfort in and of ourselves, like seeing it in ourselves, and also that discomfort of talking about this stuff. Would this be a good time to stop sharing my screen and go to questions?
We don't have no questions. That's why this is so cool.
So we actually don't have any questions. But I have a comment. I was actually surprised when I did the link for the implicit bias. I thought I did a few of them, and some of them I was less biased than I would have initially thought in the beginning. Like I thought, of course I'm a white woman, I'm going to have some kind of biases for certain categories. And there were some categories where I had less bias than I thought I would have, which made me feel better. And then there were other categories where I was like, oh, I definitely know that I'm not totally neutral on this stance. And and those were sort of accurate. So I was just sort of interested in if other people were surprised in their test results. There is one chat thing somebody said. Somebody said one thing that enters into what you just said is that the only bad question is the one you don't ask.
Mm-hmm.
So that's back to Dr. Holmes. So I didn't know other people were sort of surprised by their outcomes of their home testing. I don't know if you guys did any of the links if any of the speakers did the links, if there were any that sort of surprised you, or I don't know, just thoughts.
There are very few things that surprised me. I think just because I always plead ignorance. Like, I mean, so I wasn't really surprised, but it definitely like was like, oh, it kind of spurred me on to be like, I still have work to do. And kind of, I guess maybe I was more surprised at how lazy I probably had become. Like, just like, oh yeah, I thought I was, I mean, like I knew I wasn't perfect, but I was like, yeah, I thought I was gonna be like, oh no, you think I have some work to do? And it's constantly working on stuff. So I think I guess I would say that surprised me, like, oh, I'm not where I thought I should be. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was pretty.
There's a comment that just came in. Somebody said I was surprised. I was more biased towards males and occupation, and women associated more with the family. So it's so interesting how you don't. I need to go back and do all of the links because I only did a handful, but that's. I don't know. It gives you something to think about.
And I mean, the thing to keep in mind too, I was definitely dismayed at some of mine, but I think we all, when we see that disconnect between what we want to believe about ourselves and what's just kind of there, that, I mean, like you were saying, Dr. Holmes, about, okay, well, I got more work to do. Yeah, I mean, we do. And also just to recognize this stuff is, it's not like we freely choose these associations that, we kind of inherit, or we soak up all the stuff that we're exposed to. It's from, our family, it's from school, it's from the media, it's from just kind of the culture that we're in, it's from the people around us. So it is a lot of work to undo all that programming. So I think we also have to kind of just have that understanding and patience and not get too discouraged.
So there's a question. I'm going to answer this because I'm just going to. I've never seen a Black or Hispanic patient RIMG. Do you know the percentages of minority patients you have? I'll say I don't know the percentages. I've seen some, but I don't know the percentages. But I've only been here since February, and I've seen some.
I think yes. So I don't know the answer either to that question of specifics. I will agree we don't have a very racially diverse population, but what I will say is that we have a more culturally diverse population in some ways. Like we have a lot of people who are from around the world who appear white but have they grew up in totally different places. So that's always something to think about. Is just when you look at somebody, you don't always know where they come from. But yeah, we do have some. I don't want to because you haven't seen one doesn't mean they don't exist, but we do have a very white population. I think it reflects probably the population of Rockville and Potomac more so than something about our practice. We also, I think Dr. Council, who just joined us, does speak, I think either she's fluent in Spanish or she speaks some Spanish, so that might draw a little bit of a different population. I think a lot of people who might be speaking of other languages tend to get certain patients. Like I know Dr. Liu had a decent, I think, Vietnamese population, just because they feel more comfortable. They can converse with her. I don't think she was totally fluent in Vietnamese. I think she had lost a lot of it, if I recall, as a child. But she had enough to make people feel comfortable, like Dr. Holmes was saying earlier. People like to relate to people who look and sound like them. But yeah, we don't have a huge amount, but I think it reflects probably more just who lives in Rockville and Potomac than necessarily. I'd like to think something in our practice that drives people of color away.
Yeah. But also, I'm curious to know if with what the kind of trickle down effect is, by hiring decisions. Like I've got one patient, so I see a lot of people. I have one Black patient right now, so that, just from my vantage point. But she is new to RAMG and she followed Dr. Council over. So, when people feel connected to their provider and, so Dr. Council just wrote, some of my African-American patients from previous practice have followed me, so there may be a small increase in racial diversity in the office. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, I was going to say, it's interesting. So I did my residency in Baltimore, where it was like the opposite, right? It was like, I don't know, 99% African-American. And I still remember my first day of my residency, which was done, I did that in Fairfax in Virginia. And I walked in and my patient was white. And I was surprised because I was a white patient and so many, very, 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 very rare. It was like you just assumed they were going to be a certain color. And so you know, and I remember just being like, oh, whoa, you know, like you're a white man, you know, like, which is now, you know, it's the opposite. So diversity, you know, even though I guess to have really a diverse population is probably not very common in a lot of America. You're probably more in, just depending on what neighborhoods you're in and where you live, and where you practice, you're more likely to have a homogenous population with some diversity as opposed to like, you know, truly equal representation. All right. Well, I think, you know, some people have some other comments. I have to run. I don't know if do you guys have time to stick around for another few minutes? If not,
I've got time for another like 5 minutes or so.
Yeah. Okay. So if you guys want to, if there's any other last minute comments here or questions, Dr. Moskowitz and Dr. Holmes will handle them. Otherwise, I will see everybody back on Monday for Dr. Patil's talk on a talk about things that we don't like to talk about, some rectal curiosities. So it should be good. So I'll see you guys next week and have a good weekend.
It's good seeing you, Eleanor.
All right, bye.
So as for other questions, are you able to see? I don't see anything else in the.
I see a comment that there is some bias in the order of the questions on the implicit bias screening test, which, you know, yeah, I definitely I've done it several times, like but I mean, you know, with you have to take that with, you know, the people who are creating the test even have their own biases. About like what, because I think there was one test that I had done like a long time ago where it started off trying to deal with, I think it was the racial bias test, and they started off with African American, you know what I mean? And it's like, you're like, okay, well, if you started off that way, you're skewing people to, you know, this. So I mean, you're gonna have that no matter, you know, because every person has their own bias. Yeah.
And there's some criticism of the IAT, and I think one of the criticisms is also it doesn't have great retest reliability, which means if the same person takes it on different occasions, you're going to have different results. And also there's some questions about how much it actually translates into behavior. You know, just because people have that you know, association, does that mean they actually act differently towards different groups? And so there's definitely plenty of criticisms there. I think I find the value in it. It's just kind of remind ourselves. I mean, it's one way of quantifying it, and it's a way of opening up the questions, you know, questions of ourselves and questions of other people, and just reminding ourselves that we don't always know ourselves as well as we think we do.
As well as think we do. Yeah. But I don't see any other questions. But I do want to say thank you so much for joining me on this talk and letting like doing everything. Like I really enjoyed I really enjoyed this. This was
great. And I hope, you know, I think we're at this.
I don't understand. Oh, sorry, that's my watch saying I don't understand. Of course you don't understand why I love Dr. Watts.
You know, and I hope that this is just one opening to a conversation. I think, you know, we're at this moment in time where you know, people are finally able to start to have these conversations more and hopefully be able to talk about things that are uncomfortable. So I appreciate having this opportunity to do this with you and for everybody who tuned in for our webinar today. And I hope we'll get to continue more conversations like this.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.